Hi, everyone. We're going to let everybody join the Zoom. And while we're doing that, please answer our poll questions. We have 3 polls for you before we get started. And we also have an opportunity to introduce yourself to everybody attending in the chat. So go ahead and do that and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, thank you so much for responding to our first poll to give you a sense and give us a sense of who's here. We have a really good mix of attorneys and social service providers and interested community members. We also have survivors and survivor advocates joining us today. So thank you all so much for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and launch our next poll. All right, it looks like we have the vast majority of you have worked on trafficking issues and with survivors before. So we are here with a group of experts. This is very helpful for us to know. And finally, one last question. If you've ever worked with trafficking survivors who were trafficked through illicit massage businesses. Looks like we have over half of you, 68% have not worked specifically with this population. So it's really good to know we have a lot of trafficking experts, some of which about a third have worked with this particular population and 2/3 have not. And you can feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat as we get started with today's program. Next slide, please. All right, today's program is the second part in our 3-part series. Today's training will focus on a survivor-centered approach to identifying and serving trafficking victims involved in illicit massage. And I will be moderating today and just really welcoming all of you and our amazing panelists. My name is Jamie Beck, and I'm the president and managing attorney of Free to Thrive. Little housekeeping before we jump in. All of you are muted and we can't see you. Feel free to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves, whether it's go for a walk or eat your lunch, stand up, move around, whatever you need to do right now. We do have our Q&A chat function open, and we will answer questions during the webinar. We'll mostly save them for the end, but we may take some questions along the way. And also feel free to include your thoughts in the chat. I know many of you are introducing yourselves in the chat, and it's great to see so many friends and colleagues here joining all of us today. And lastly, just note that this training will be recorded and will be sent to all attendees following the training. Before we jump into the content of this training, we just want to take a moment to mourn the lives that were lost this week and just have a moment. I would like to take a moment of silence to really honor the lives that were lost and their memories. So let's take one moment of silence. Thank you. I think we're all still reeling from this really sad and traumatic news, and our thoughts are with the loved ones of these murder victims. Now, there's a lot that we don't know, and we're going to learn a lot more as this investigation unfolds. But what we do know is that this crime was targeted at businesses, massage businesses specifically, that are known to mostly employ people of Asian descent. We also know that 6 out of the 8 victims were of Asian descent. And we know that the suspect, blamed the businesses that he targeted for being an outlet for his sexual addiction. And he said he engaged in the shooting to eliminate the temptation. Now, we don't know if this suspect ever received any commercial sex services from these establishments, and we definitely don't want to jump to any conclusions that he did. We also don't want to perpetuate stereotypes about massage businesses as all offering these services, because that does no justice to the individuals that work at these businesses. We also need to acknowledge that despite what the suspect may have said, that this crime was motivated by racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and white supremacy. This crime took place in a wider context of a long history in the US of racial discrimination towards individuals of Asian descent. And we know that we've seen a huge uptick in hate crimes directed at Asian people in the last year. We have to look at this crime in that broader context and in the historical context of our country. And in the context of today's training, we have to understand that the demand for commercial sex comes from sex buyers, and that's what fuels human trafficking through illicit massage businesses. This is an issue of supply and demand. If there were not people out there who would like to pay money for commercial sex, we wouldn't have human trafficking and illicit massage businesses. And so today we're going to focus on how we as a community can better serve trafficking survivors who are being trafficked specifically through illicit massage businesses in a trauma-informed and culturally competent manner. And I hope that you all take care of yourselves this week. It's a really just sad week for our country, sad week for the community in Atlanta and all of us. And our prayers are definitely with all of those who are mourning. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with Free to Thrive empowers survivors of human trafficking by providing them with holistic and trauma-informed legal and support services in collaboration with our service partners, and by increasing access to justice for all survivors. If you want to learn more about Free to Thrive, you can visit our website. And it is my distinct honor to introduce our incredible speakers today. These are really experts in this space who have been serving this particular community for many years, and we're really honored to have them and to be able to partner with all of the organizations that they're associated with: Garden of Hope, Sanctuary for Families, and ECPAT USA. Our first speaker is Yvonne Chen, who is the Director of Private Sector Engagement at ECPAT USA. Our next speaker is Eve He, who is a multilingual mental health counselor with Garden of Hope. And finally, Kathy Liu, who is the staff attorney at Sanctuary for Families. I thank all of our speakers for being here today and educating all of us. I highly recommend you check out their organizations and their full bios, which were provided to in advance of this training and will be provided after the training as well, because they really are doing incredible work. With that, I will turn it over to our speakers who will take it from here. I hope you enjoy the training.
Thank you so much, Jamie. If you don't mind going to the next slide, Sophie. Awesome. So like Jamie said, I'm Kathy Liu. I am a staff attorney with Sanctuary for Families. We are one of the largest New York-based nonprofits serving survivors of gender-based violence. And we provide a holistic approach to assisting survivors from legal, clinical, and other support services, including employment. We work to help survivors regain their agency and be able to access resources to help them rebuild their lives. And in my work in the anti-trafficking initiative, I work with majority East Asian clients who are trafficked through illicit massage establishments and work primarily on their immigration and criminal advocacy cases.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Yvonne Chen. I am the Director of Private Sector Engagement for ECPAT USA. And ECPAT USA's mission is to protect every child's human right to grow up free from the threat of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And so we do this through policy and advocacy, private sector engagement, youth engagement, and community education. And so we focus specifically on prevention and advocacy and working on with young people, as well as educating people who work in the private sector, as well as really doing a lot of work in the legislative advocacy space. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eve He. I'm a mental health counselor with Human Trafficking Intervention Team at Garden of Hope. So my agency, Garden of Hope, that we are serving individuals, specifically in Chinese community, who has been exposed to like domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And for me personally, like my work, other than doing psychotherapy with survivors and doing assessment, doing victim screening, and we do provide a lot of case management, such as legal assistance, crisis intervention, like housing options. We have safe houses. I guess it's an integrated care or a whole approach for the survivors that has been exposed to gender-based violence. Thank you. Next slide, please. This is just like a very briefly showing you what in Garden of Hope, that what kind of approach that we take and what kind of areas that we serve the clients, and especially after being identified by other providers or by us, what is the next step for them, like legal, occupation, and housing, mental health, family, and especially in legal, that we cooperate with other agencies such as Sanctuary for Family, that for legal assistance for clients. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we actually wrote up this current landscape slide well before the shootings in Atlanta 2 days ago, because we felt it was so important to address the spike in anti-Asian racism and violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what has happened in Atlanta has really just crystallized this for us. I mean, of course, anyone can be trafficked through an illicit massage establishment, but what we have seen is that the trend is predominantly East Asian women. And I think you can see on this panel, all three panelists, all of us are API women. And so it's hard not to see what happened in Atlanta and realize that something very similar could happen to our clients, could happen to people who share our background. And I know that the police captain of Cherokee County near Atlanta said that he refused to say really that there was racial motivation for the crime, despite the fact that it targeted 3 Asian spas and killed mostly Asian women. We can't look at this outside of the context of what is going on right now in the COVID-19 pandemic. I have some numbers on the slide for you. A coalition of API-led nonprofit organizations across the country compiled reports of 3,800 anti-Asian attacks over just 1 year since the pandemic started. And there's a huge gender slant to the data as well. Almost 70% are against women, which I think really highlights the intersectional challenges that API women and many of our clients face in this context. Of course, we see many of these attacks happening on the street, right, in public spaces, but we also see many attacks on API-owned or frequented businesses. There is increased fear, not just anxiety, right, about working in public-facing job positions during a pandemic, but also about potentially encountering this kind of hate and violence because of their racial background. And added on top of that, there are hugely limited job opportunities simply because of the business closures forced by the pandemic. So this has become yet another very significant source of vulnerability for many of the clients that we see. And I also just want to take a moment to say here that the reason that I'm kind of getting on the soapbox here is because I think if you want to do this work with this group of victims and survivors, you need to center this in your work. These prejudices are prevalent throughout the general population, no matter what kind of space you are in, no matter what field you're in, no matter what level we are talking about, right? We see these prejudices all around us, including in law enforcement, right? With the police captain that I spoke about who refused to acknowledge a racial slant to the killings based on the shooter's word that it wasn't racial. And a man who, it was later found, he had posted several racist remarks about the quote unquote Chinese virus and even peddled merchandise with the Chinese virus slogan on it publicly on his social media profile before it was deleted yesterday. And what I am trying to get at is that all of us have work to do. We need to work on ourselves. We need to work on the organizations that we are in, as well as the agencies that we partner with. All of us have work to do because as we can see, this is an issue that is deeply rooted in US history. It's an issue that is deeply impacting our clients, even though many of them are recently arrived immigrants and don't know exactly the kind of context that they've been dropped into, but can feel on a visceral level that something about their race and gender is impacting the way that they are seen and treated in the US. So yeah, thank you. Next slide, please. So I now want to get into a little bit more about the trends of what we've been seeing in illicit massage parlor trafficking. Next slide, please. So what we tend to see is a rather complex business model, maybe compared to some of the other trafficking models that we've seen in other areas, because very often what you see is an operation that is purporting to operate a legitimate business front, right? They have some kind of legitimate service that they are purporting to offer. Oftentimes they are licensed, and yet they also serve as fronts for commercial sexual activity. But because of their more legitimate kind of business appearance, they are able to advertise openly in newspapers and other social media networks. These places do tend to have all male clientele, and they are often situated in Asian enclaves. So speaking as someone who works in New York, I very often see clients trafficked through places in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, or Flushing, Queens, New York. Next slide, please. And so this is just one example of a newspaper ad that we see very frequently. So 10,000 per month as salary. We are looking for people who can provide good service for massage in other US states. And so I'd love to get participants to kind of say in the chat whether anything about this advertisement strikes them as a little bit off or might be a red flag. I see someone saying the 10 grand, right? Anything else? Yeah, very high salary. Other US states needing to relocate, perfect. Yes, no hours, no location, perfect. That's exactly right. So I think for many of us who, especially people who have kind of grown up in the US, right? We see a newspaper advertisement like this and we think it's a little bit sketchy. We know that the salary amount is too high. We know that it's a little weird that they're saying other states, but not specifying exactly where. But I also want to point out that oftentimes the people who are answering these newspaper advertisements are recently arrived immigrants, right? Who don't have the same kind of cultural background and knowledge of how things are done in the United States, and who don't necessarily know what the going rate is, right? What is reasonable to expect as a salary, but in fact are operating off of stereotypes or rumors that they might have heard from friends that people in the US just tend to make a lot of money. And so very often, even though we see red flags, right, as people who may have grown up here, these red flags are not readily apparent to many other people. Okay, next slide, please. So here I talk a little bit about a victim profile. As I said before, anyone can be trafficked through illicit massage establishments. And so what I have here is really just a general trend, because this is a question that we get asked a lot. So very often they are women, they are East Asian, and they are in their 30s to 50s, which sometimes surprises people a little bit, because I think especially in mainstream media, trafficking victims are portrayed as being underage, as being teenagers, things like that. But oftentimes we are serving clients who are middle-aged, right? Who have maybe lived in their home country for the majority of their lives and grown into adults before coming into the United States. And we also oftentimes see that they incur tens of thousands of dollars in debt, maybe to enter the United States, but maybe not, right? I think debt is something that I see so often in my clients. It's almost like a unifying factor among them. And they incur it in a number of different ways. Sometimes they take out loans in China, sometimes their family does. But whatever the reason, many, many of them come to the United States saddled with this kind of immense debt. And they don't usually enter without inspection. They often have some kind of travel documentation. It's usually a tourist visa. And then they enter and then they overstay. And that's when they become undocumented. And then talking again about trafficker recruitment, they're often recruited through deceptive newspaper ads. Sometimes they are smuggled in, and so the smuggler maybe arranges for their travel arrangements and then arranges for them to be placed in a specific massage establishment. And very often we also see this kind of person-to-person job referral. So reaching out to friends of a friend of a friend, maybe someone who is from your hometown or home province from the home country, and having that common background and gender trust, and then accepting a job that you might not know really anything about. And then finally, one last somewhat idiosyncratic thing that we see a lot is that they oftentimes have already applied for asylum with a different service provider, which I'll talk a little bit more later. Next slide, please. Okay, so trafficker tactics. We see again debt. And I want to point out here that this debt is sometimes held by the trafficker. Maybe the trafficker is the one who made the travel arrangements and so charged exorbitant fees to get them that tourist visa. But equally possible is that the trafficker doesn't actually hold the debt, that the debt is held by somebody else. And so these stories are often very complex, right? There's many different parties in the story, and sometimes it just makes for a messier picture. But even if the debt is not held by the trafficker can still use it as a pressure point to coerce the victim, because they know that the victim needs this money. Maybe the family is under threat by loan sharks, and somehow needs to come up with a debt payment. And so this is still a way for the trafficker to exert control over the victim, even if the trafficker isn't actually the one holding the debt. And of course, you see threats of harm, isolation. Very often there are threats of deportation because they know that the victim is undocumented. What we see a little bit less frequently is physical violence. And so I think sometimes this also muddies the picture, especially for people who are not very used to these narratives, who haven't seen this before. The traffickers use more subtle tactics that can sometimes be written off as not really coercing the victim, even though it really pulls on these deep-seated cultural factors that are very, very powerful, especially for our East Asian clients. And so that is something that we also, I think as a lawyer, I often have to draw that out a lot in their immigration applications to explain exactly why these more subtle tactics were used to create this atmosphere where the victim didn't have any choice. And then second bullet point, again, going back to the out-of-state idea, they are often forced to live on site at the massage parlor, often sleeping on top of the same narrow massage beds where they are expected to see customers, and then often moved with very little notice. And I just want to highlight here that even I think for maybe for someone like me who grew up in the United States, who knows like US geography, being forced to move to a different US state with little to no notice would be extremely disorienting for me. And for many of our clients, they don't have a lot of formal education in China. And even if they have, they weren't being taught the different US states. And so maybe they know the state that they're being moved to, but they don't know where it is in relation to their home base. They don't know how to get back. And their entire support network is in their home base, right? It's not in that random state. Maybe Delaware we see sometimes, Pennsylvania. The people that they know are maybe back in Flushing or back in Brooklyn. And so that just creates an extra layer of isolation and inability to really access services or access people who could help them get out of the situation. And then finally, we also see victims really being trained to tell kind of a canned story to law enforcement and service providers, traffickers really telling them exactly what to say if they are ever interviewed. And I think this is very successful because they are able to play on these people's existing distrust for the US government, for US-based service providers. Next slide, please. And so this slide kind of sums up the common challenges. A lot of it I've already touched on previously. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into it too much more here. I'll just pause a moment to let everybody kind of read what's on here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I have a case study here about a client named Mandy, which is a pseudonym. And so I'd like this to be an opportunity for y'all to kind of issue spot. Jamie told me that in the first training, all of you have already been introduced to the definition of trafficking. I also see that over 90% of participants have trafficking experience. So I'd like you to kind of read through this case study and then answer a couple of poll questions about what you're seeing in this lineup of facts. So I think, Jamie, if you don't mind pulling up that first poll associated with this slide. It would be awesome if participants can answer the poll and then write a few lines to kind of justify their answer in the chat, whatever they feel comfortable sharing. Oh, someone's telling me they can't read the prompt. Let me summarize it really quick. Mandy is from China. Her mother has over $100,000 worth of debt and so pressures Mandy to come to the US to work and send money home. And then she meets Jason, who is a US citizen in the United States, and begins a relationship with him. But he persuades her to work at an illicit massage business to support themselves. And he is the one who drives her to and from work. And he starts demanding to borrow money from her and even just taking money out of her purse without asking. And at the illicit massage establishment, she's sexually harassed and assaulted by customers. She's told by bosses that it's normal, so she just needs to deal with it. And Jason tells her that she just needs to focus on the kind of money she's making because she's supporting their family. And then she's arrested by police, at which point she tells Jason that she wants to stop. And in response, he beats her. And although she thinks about calling 911, Jason always kind of hammers in that he is a US citizen, she doesn't have papers. So if she tries to reach out, she's going to be the one who is in trouble and likely end up deported. Okay, I'll give a cut, like maybe 20 more seconds for people to respond. In particular, I'm very interested in seeing kind of in the chat what you see in the scenario that makes you think it's trafficking versus not trafficking. Okay, so I see the results that the vast majority of people said yes to both sex and labor trafficking. So I see people here saying that there's force and coercion, that she doesn't have ability to control her work or finances or call the police. There's also commercial sex acts involved. I love that people are saying that there's both sex and labor trafficking. I think the sex trafficking is quite easy to like kind of issue spot because of the commercial sex aspect. But he's also taking all of her money, right? He's essentially using her as kind of like a source of labor and income. And I love also people are noting the domestic violence, right? The grooming through the relationship. And also, I love also people pointing out that he's the one driving her to work, right? So she doesn't really have freedom of movement. She is either at home with Jason or being driven by Jason to the massage parlor where she's then under the surveillance of the boss and the customers. Okay, can we pull up the second poll question? So I'm also curious as to what you all think about who her trafficker is, because we have a few different parties in this lineup of facts, right? We have Jason, we have the various massage bosses, we have customers. So maybe let's leave this up for 30 seconds and then pull up the results. Okay. Wow, this is a very even split. 50% saying just Jason, 50% saying all of the above. Yeah, so I think this one is a pretty close call. I would say Jason is definitely a trafficker, right? That there's like no question about Jason being one of the traffickers. But as far as whether the bosses and the customers are traffickers as well, I think you'd have to inquire a little bit more into the situation. Right now, what we see is that the bosses say to her that this is normal and you just need to deal with it. And that might not necessarily reach the threshold, right, of a threat or of coercion. And so we would need to learn a little bit more about how bosses are treating her and what kind of environment they are creating in the illicit massage establishment. And then customers as well. I just threw in there because I think oftentimes we kind of overlook customers as potential traffickers when we have had cases at Sanctuary where there wasn't like a clear kind of head honcho trafficker, but our clients were being threatened by customers into providing commercial sexual services. And in those situations, we could name the customer as the trafficker too. Okay, next slide, please. And I'll hand this over to Yvonne.
Hi, everyone. So thanks so much for listening to all of that. You know, I think we really also want to emphasize that these people's experiences are one part of their experience. So as the case example kind of shows, a lot of times there are multiple things happening at multiple times. And at many times there's multiple layers to it. People are experiencing multiple forms of trauma, multiple forms of victimization. And so that's, I think, you know, one thing that we do want to highlight. So when we talk about outreach, we want to think about what is the purpose of our outreach? What are we trying to do? And what are we trying to engage, or who are we trying to engage, and what are we trying to do? So for people who want to do outreach to this community, I would ask, what is the purpose of this? Because I think part of it is there are many people who want to get people out of their situations immediately, but I think it doesn't take into consideration the basic necessities that need to be met. So food, housing, it also really doesn't speak to the debt that also plays into a lot of our, the clients that we worked with in their lives. So if the purpose is to get people connected to services, then that's a great opportunity. If the purpose is immediate reaction is to get someone out of a situation that may not be the safest, we want to think about how we're providing other things along that, because it's not only about just getting someone out of their situation. We need to think about the after of that as well. So the purpose of really just engaging with folks, I feel like the best way to really do long-term sustainable outreach is to think about connections. How do we connect with people in this space? So types of outreach. I've done nighttime outreach to massage businesses. So that looked like going to different massage businesses at night in specific areas. And I had gone on a monthly basis. And so really building up relationships with people who are working in those massage establishments. And I think part of the thing is the continuity of it and the repetition of it. It was really helped build this sort of understanding and trust. And so we would give gifts every month, and we would just talk to them about their lives, whatever they wanted to share with us. If they were busy, we would just drop off gifts and leave. If they had a lot of just things they wanted to chat about, whether it be the weather or customers, or a lot of times talking about their families, how they miss their families, who their children were, how their families are. And so I think one of the things that I actually had realized while I was doing a lot of this outreach is them as full humans, and what does it look like to see them that way? And so when we look at people as full humans and not just one aspect of their victimization that we might be seeing or might be hearing or viewing, how can we serve these people in the best way that they need? So just really thinking about that. So the nighttime outreach, we are able to just be able to build those relationships and continue to build. Sorry, I think someone is unmuted. If someone could mute. Or if people could mute. So that's just kind of one of the things that is really helpful in doing that. And so I've been able to really see people as resilient caretakers. They are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to take care of their loved ones. I've also done law enforcement initiated outreach and investigations. And I think one of the things about that is the outreaches that we had done with them were in response to community complaints, and no one was arrested at that time. And it was a time that they had wanted to bring a service provider in and able to really connect with folks. I will say for the law enforcement initiated outreach and going with them, what they would do is they would go in and they would, if there were customers there, then they would have them leave, and then I would be able to talk to someone individually, essentially, just to say that I worked at an organization and I spent a lot of time telling people that I was not law enforcement. But again, my goal out of those outreaches was to be able to exchange WeChat information, to be able to talk to them and connect with them at a later point. So the goal is not to hear all of their stories of potential exploitation and their hardships, but really just a connection point in which we can connect. And so I think that's part of the things, like, well, I thought the nighttime outreach was really good, and because it was not connected to law enforcement necessarily, and so there wasn't that piece to it. And because I think we also have to remember, but also explaining what a nonprofit is, a lot of people don't know these systems. And so what is a nonprofit agency? A lot of times home countries have nonprofit agencies, but they're actually connected to the government. So what does that look like? How do we explain those things? What does law enforcement look like in home countries? Thinking about those. Another type of outreach that I had done was the New York State has human trafficking intervention courts. And so what had happened was people who are arrested on prostitution related charges, also including unlicensed practice, were brought to a diversion court part. And the diversion court part, they had a few options, one which included taking X amount of sessions with a service provider. And so while that was happening, those sessions would really be very catered to what the client had wanted. And so they had options to be able to connect with people. And so those were some of the ways that I had met a lot of the people. And actually with the nighttime outreach I was doing, I actually saw a good amount of people come through that court system. And in that way, I also had built some trust as well, because I think we have to remember that going into a system that you don't know and are not familiar with is very frightening. So really thinking about that is important. And this is, while I think that the intervention courts were a space where I was able to connect with a lot of people. We also spent a lot of time really building trust, because arrests themselves are really traumatic. And so really thinking about that, and there's multiple layers to this, and how we need to be patient, I think, with the time that we spend with people and how we can really foster these relationships with them. And so long-term planning sustainability. So we really need to think about what this means long-term. So if we want to do outreach and we want to connect with folks who are in this space and working in massage businesses and massage establishments, then we need to think about what are some practical needs that we are offering. And this is one of the cultural nuances, but I also think cultural awareness, that piece that we need to understand, that we also have to really think about providing practical needs. I think that clients often are in survival mode that I've worked with, and so they want to think about, but how can you help them practically? Is it bringing their families over? Is it helping them with immigration status? What are some of these things? Because if you're just telling someone that this is not a good situation for them and they need to leave, what other options are we providing? So I think these are just some of the things to factor in, because as much as good intentions can really fuel a lot of outreach, we want to think about the impact as well. Next slide, please.
Hey, Yvonne, before you go
Yes.
on, we actually had a great question in the chat that I'd love you to answer. So Susan asked, how are you able to successfully personally connect with the victims without interference from their trafficker? And I assume that definitely goes to the first point of when you were doing outreach in the evenings.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to realize is a lot of times traffickers are actually not in the massage businesses and massage establishments. So a lot of times traffickers are watching people through the cameras and their security cameras that they have. And so I think it really is just building this connection. So I will say, for the street outreach that I did, there were definitely places that didn't allow us in. And then there were other places that allowed us in to connect with them. And I saw multiple people move through different establishments. So I think it really is just about building some of that trust, and then also offering some practical services. So I didn't go in there saying, I want to take you out of this situation, or I want to save you from anything. This is really about knowing them as humans and figuring out, if someone had mentioned that they had talked to, they wanted to bring their family over, they had an immigration person. I was lucky enough to work with Kathy as well. And I would say, well, we have free immigration consultations. So why don't I set up a time for you to be able to do that? It's confidential. I explained what that meant. So really just kind of thinking about some of those things. And so that's how I was able to really connect with people without interference from the trafficker at that establishment specifically. Yeah. And so best practices for identifying people. So again, thinking about the cultural nuances and dynamics, I think explaining things is really important. And so really thinking about, we can't assume that people understand what our systems are. So similar to if I were dropped off, where I arrived in a different country that I did not know the language and I could not read anything. It was nothing similar to the words or letters that I know. How can we really think about how to engage with people who may feel that they don't know everything that's happening? And so some of the cultural nuances where they, I think are really thinking about, how do we talk about things? And so a lot of clients in this specific community may not respond well to specific questions. So even kind of talking about sex and talking about triggering things and talking about assault, things like that, is not a very direct conversation. And so that's something to that we think about. And dynamics, really thinking about how people think about collective in the community. And so if we're asking specific targeted questions about tell me who wronged you, I think it's a really hard question because a lot of times there is so much shame involved, which has also a lot of layers of respect of hierarchy and elders in the community. So there's a lot of different things like that. Native language and speakers or translators, you know, we want to ensure that just because someone speaks the language does not mean they are trauma informed, nor does it mean that they understand the nuances and the subtleties and the coercion and trafficking that is happening in this community. I will use myself as an example. Before I had done this work, I was working specifically with Spanish speakers, but I am Asian American and I do speak the native tongue, but I did not know what trafficking looked like within this specific community. And so I think, you know, we just can't assume that just because someone, you know, and it's a whole nother conversation about how Asians, the continent of Asia is not a monolith, and there are 100 countries and things like that. And so I think those are just some things to keep in mind. And so if people want to reach out to us, we can definitely talk to people about what it means to train translators to be trauma informed as well. Medical outreach, you know, they're in New York City, there's an Empower Center that's a clinic that's based out of a hospital in New York City. And it's really thinking about connecting people to services. And so hospitals and healthcare centers often are around the clock, I guess, so that they have accessibility to translators. And this Empower Center is intended for a one-stop shop. So you can get connected to an attorney, you can get connected to a medical care, a social worker and counselor. There's also peer navigators, which typically are survivors who are helping people navigate systems as well, because they've been in part of the system. So just thinking about that. Criminalized victims, it's important to also realize the intersectionality of people being arrested as well for other crimes that are poverty driven. And we want to, poverty is a root cause, one of the root causes of trafficking. So domestic violence also happens. A lot of people, victims of other crimes for like wage theft as well, robbery. People also get arrested for petty theft. So things like that. What other avenues where are you already serving communities, and that they might be experiencing one type of victimization, but what are the other ways that they could be victimized, such as trafficking and such as other traumas. So just kind of really thinking about that is how we can I want to say paint a fuller picture of what outreach can look like, because I think it's really important that we're not only going in with one mindset of how a specific person can look and what trafficking can look like, but it's really important to think about all the other aspects that people are dealing with and really thinking about. We can go to the next slide. And I will hand it over to Eve.
Thank you, Yvonne. So in this part, I want to share with you some of my experiences doing assessment and how to identify someone as being trafficked. And I think exactly like what Yvonne said, if you want to work with this population, the wording, the culture, the dynamic is something is always need to be mindful. I know most of you already probably know this. Most of the clients, they reach out either voluntarily or involuntarily. They are not going to identify or self-identify as someone being trafficked. First of all, especially in the Chinese community, being trafficked is a term that is very unfamiliar. People don't really know much about it. And also, when you actually translate human trafficking in Chinese, it's a very academic term that people don't really use that much. And also on top of that, the trust and the being scared of law enforcement, there's a lot of layers. So doing assessment is definitely something very difficult. And very commonly used is, at least what I use is trafficking victim identification tool, but I didn't put in here because it's both helpful and unhelpful. If you actually do the assessment as this tool structured, or there's many screening tools to screen human trafficking victims, you might not really get any response especially for Chinese clients. And to demonstrate a little bit better, that I invite Yvonne that we can have a very short role play to do a very quick screening. We can start from, which is a typical screening session, and I will respond in English, but in real time, most likely you would need a translator. So we can start as I walk in and sit down nervously.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. Hi.
Okay, well, I'm from ECPAT USA. I just wanted to let you know that everything is confidential unless you tell me otherwise. I'm a mandated reporter, so under extreme circumstances that you'll be hurt, or that you'll hurt yourself or others, or if children are in danger, then I will need to report. So I'm going to ask you a few questions if that's fine.
Okay.
Great.
Sure.
So can you tell me why you left your country?
Me, I just come and see. My friend told me that America's very nice, so I just come and visit.
Oh, okay. Did anyone where you worked, or if you had any other activities, did anyone ever trick or pressure you into doing anything that you did not want to do?
No.
Okay. Did anyone ever pressure you to touch someone or have any unwanted physical or sexual contact with anyone?
No.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a very short one, and thank you so much, Yvonne. Great job. So this one, what I want to demonstrate is, if you ask those questions this way, which is nothing really wrong about the whole role play, the confidentiality introduced and a question asked, but you are not going to get any response. If I ask those questions, I will get the same response as you do. It doesn't really matter if I have the same cultural background and I speak the same language. It's simply, I guess it's definitely complicated reasons. I won't elaborate today because of time, but obviously those questions are very intrusive. And also the core issues, there's no trust. But there are something I find it helpful in my experiences that make the assessment more comfortable and safer for them to disclose or share something with you. So the first one, a lot of times when clients come in, and just like the role play, you start asking those questions, which is doing your job, nothing is wrong with that. But imagine this client very likely has been traumatized or still in a very traumatic situation. There's some clients maybe referred to you involuntarily. There's a lot of concerns, there's a lot of confusion. So they are preoccupied and nervous. At this time, you pull out a form that will definitely will be beneficial to starting that building trust. So starting with asking their questions, answering their questions. I'll give you one example. So some of my clients refer by court. They can see me through this diversion program and get their criminal charges dismissed. So when they come in, instead of asking all those questions, all I need to know is they understand confidentiality. I know their name. And then I will start with, do you understand what to expect with your case? Do you have any concerns over the case? Like address their needs first and make them more easy or more comfortable to share their part with you. And also have a conversation. Like in the role play, those questions, for example, can you tell me why you left your country? So first of all, this sounds a little bit intrusive, and in some circumstances, they can be even interpreted as aggressive. So instead of just checking those boxes, what we can do is we can remember all those questions in your head and having a conversation with them to see as less intimidating. Because especially in the Chinese community, we respect authorities, but it also means that we are scared of authorities. You're wearing the suits, wearing a uniform, and having a form and asking a bunch of questions. I don't understand why you're asking. It's very intimidating and it's very uncomfortable. And also for a lot of Chinese clients, we're also polite. So we're not gonna tell you, they're not gonna confront you saying that this is very uncomfortable. I need you to stop. All they would do is passively answer all those questions and feeling violated and then left. And that is all. So having a natural conversation, like the same question, can you tell me why you left your country? It can be easy saying that, oh, like, did you came here by yourself? Do you have any family here to support you? Well, it must be really difficult to living here. Like, I wonder what kind of reasons that make you to come to the US. Show them you're curious and make them feel safer and make the conversation less intimidating. And also give examples. Like, I love a lot of screening tools. There are open-ended questions, especially from perspective in assessment, you definitely not want to be leading your client. But questions like, can you tell me, have you ever, like somebody ever pressured to do something that you don't want to do? This is a very broad, and the client wouldn't really know what direction you're going to. So give small examples to make them better understand why you're asking and what you are asking. And those are the three things that I find it most helpful in my assessment. And also the end of the session, please, especially the end of the assessment session, please spend some time to explain why you ask those questions. Even this individual are not yet identified by you as a victim of human trafficking. Those are questions, I look at them, I think it's a violation of my privacy if I was asked. And a lot of people are uncomfortable and they don't know why you ask those questions. It would be great if you can do like a very short version of explanation, or even being great like preventative work of doing education, what is human trafficking? And if this individual is being identified by you as a victim of human trafficking, definitely education's it's going to be incredibly helpful to help them to understand their exploitation, their experiences. But more importantly, to help them understand what does it mean to being identified by you as a victim? Like, what is coming next? What does it mean? What's their rights? For example, they can go to the law enforcement, but they have the choice to do. What kind of referrals that you can make? What kind of resources is presenting in front of them? Next slide, please. Okay, I believe that there's parts that we wanted to share with you. A survivor would want to share with you her experiences. And let me see if this client has logged in.
Yes, she is here with me. But I was wondering if Yvonne or Eve will be just asking the guided questions.
Okay, sure.
I will
I
be
can do the
asking
interpretation. I will
English.
help with the interpretation.
So I'll be asking in English. So everyone who's on, we essentially, this is what would typically happen if you don't speak the language. And so we would have an interpreter. So Eve will be the interpreter today, and I'm going to kind of ask the questions. And so, yeah. So if she's on, so thank you so much for joining us today.
谢谢你加入我们，谢谢你今天来到。
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
So I'm going to ask a few questions. One of them, we wanted to thank you so much for joining today. But we wanted to ask you, before you connected with any service providers, what were your thoughts and impressions about them? And did you know that they had even existed?
那很感谢你今天就是能够加入这个对话中来哈，然后我们可能会想要问你一些问题。那第一个问题呢，就是在你真正接触到这一些就有给你提供到服务的这些机构啊，或是工作人员啊，你知道或你的印象是什么样子的？你知道他们存在吗？
就一开始不知道他们的存在，根本就不知道还有这样的机构，一开始就是全部都不知道。
I did not know that they exist. I have no idea that those kind of services are available.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely what a lot of people that we've worked with have said as well. So thank you for sharing that.
谢谢你分享这个，感觉是很多类似有您这样的经历的人，好像都会分享的这样一件事情，就是都不知道这样的服务存在。
对，
Yes.
So because of the services that you received, we wanted to know what are some services that you found were helpful to you.
那接下来一个问题想要请问一下你，你会觉得说，你接受到的服务之中，有哪一些你是觉得有帮助的呢？
我觉得最大的帮助就是身份这个对我是最大的帮助，还有在我生活上，也是给予我很大的帮助。
I think the most helpful is definitely the assistance I received regarding my immigration, and also the support I have received in my life.
Well, we're so glad that we were able to help you with it, and thank you for your patience in it. As you know, American systems sometimes can take a long time.
那很高兴说我们真的能够帮到一些，然后我们也理解说，有的时候在整个过程之中，美国系统可能会都非常的长期，然后需要等待很长的时间。
Yeah， 是我知道。
Yeah, I know that part.
So are there any resources that you found were lacking or that you wish to had access to?
那现在想来的话，你会觉得说有哪些地方，有哪些部分的服务可以改善的呢？或者是说你本来希望说可以有，但是现在其实并没有这样的服务存在的地方？
我希望，我希望哈能在这些机构里头单独的设有英文课程什么的，因为真的在美国不会英文真的很困难，对生活啦、工作和学习都造成了很严重的困难。这个是英文是必不可少的，我觉得在美国必需品。
了解。So I think it will be definitely really helpful if we have more ESL classes in different organizations or this as a resources, because it's really difficult for us to survive in the US or to thrive in the US that if you don't speak fluent English. And I definitely think this is necessary.
Great. So those were all the questions that we wanted your insights on today. If there's anything else you wanted to share, and if not, thank you so much for your time.
那今天的话，其实这些是我们想要询问您的问题哈。那接下来的话，不知道您有没有什么还有需要想要分享给我们的？那如果没有的话，也非常感谢您的参与。
谢律师，我可以说昨天看到的那个新闻的那个事儿吗？
可以呀。
我就是想说，就是想必大家也看到了那个新闻，就是亚特兰大的那件事情。我觉得我看到这个新闻过之后，我真的我每天生活都是战战兢兢的，就感觉很害怕，特别害怕，特别恐慌。我觉得不安全。我想哈，在帮助我们这些受迫害的妇女的同时，也想倡导一下，像你们这样的机构应该很有号召力，多多的宣传，不要有这些种族歧视。毕竟光那么漂亮，是因为它没有把每个颜色区分开，对吧
？So I wanted to share that I think all of you already know the news happening in Atlanta. And ever since I know that, I've been living in fear every day. And so has many people. So today I really want to share with you that I'm really hoping that more organizations, more people would step forward, special organization that you have more reputation and have more voices, stronger voices against racism, against this harm towards our community. And the reason that why US is beautiful because it has many colors.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for your time.
谢谢你分享这些，也是很谢谢你今天来参与，然后来分享。
不客气 ，Thank you。
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I wanted to share a little about her experience. So actually, this client came to us through a court, actually. And so, sorry, I live in New York City, so there are noises outside my window often. But so she had come to us through court, and she was essentially connected to Sanctuary for Families in Garden of Hope and different service agencies, which provided multiple ways for her to get connected to services such as legal needs, as well as counseling and such like that. So that's kind of how this client was connected to us. And it's really important to highlight that she has the skills and life experience that actually qualify her for other work in the US. She couldn't access these things as an undocumented person and as someone with limited English proficiency. And Kathy can kind of talk more about this later on as well, but oftentimes when you are still applying for documentation, you're still considered undocumented. So depending on how long that takes, that has a really big barrier. And if you have limited English proficiency, that also is a challenge. And so it's really important that when we develop these services, we're really thinking about the practicalities, like I mentioned before, and the needs to support them. And so, as I said, if we're asking people to leave certain situations, do I have a living wage job for them? Do I have resources for them and for training for beyond what they think that they are only qualified for, which is what traffickers tell them. Traffickers tell them that their only available job to them is working in these illicit massage businesses, and that's the only way that they can provide for their family. So those are just some of the thoughts that we wanted to highlight, and and I will leave it to, I will give it back to Eve.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I think exactly like what Yvonne has said, if we really want to support the survivor and really want to help them to explore more options, then we do need to have those resources in place. And so we start with aftercare, because assessment after identifying a victim as human trafficking is definitely the very beginning of the whole process. So I want to share with you what, in my experiences, what I see the most as their needs and what kind of resources available right now, but what also and areas to improve. So starting with legal, Kathy, I know will later go in depth talking about their legal needs. So I was just talking very briefly, but oftentimes as service providers with attorneys, we will collaborate together and to help the clients if they have any immigration needs. Do they need T visa? Do they have any cases in criminal civil that they need to address? In terms of mental health, it's definitely, we see a lot of, in this community, a lot of stigma around mental health, but it's incredibly important, especially for our survivors. I definitely see a lot of PTSD, a lot of depression, but also because the cultural part that you might find it difficult if you wanted to refer a client to see a psychiatrist, to see a psychologist for evaluation or something. They might see it as an insult or something. So we can rephrase it in a different way. We can approach it in a different way. Like for me, I often say we just can be here, support you, and we all have moments that we feel upset and things happen that we can talk about it. And in terms of housing, so I don't really see a lot of needs for shelter. I think most of our clients or most of the individuals in Chinese community, there's definitely stigma around living a shelter. And also the restriction of shelter. Like people do want that flexibility because they do need to go to work and they do need to survive and support their families. But what I find incredibly helpful is rental assistance. So including our program that we have up to a year of rental assistance to help the client to stabilize And also not having, especially during COVID, not having those tremendous pressure that they need to travel out of state to find a job. I know there are multiple agencies are offering those rental assistance as a resources. So yeah, definitely be mindful if this could be a benefit for a client. So family support, this is not super common, but some of our clients do have children and do have their family here. And having that extra support is definitely helpful. So employment options. I leave at the end because I think this is one of the area that is need the most, like what Yvonne has described, and also the areas that lack the most. So if you are immigrant, or if you're a Chinese woman in the US, if you don't speak fluent English, if you only have a work permit or undocumented, there are 3 popular jobs that you can choose: restaurant worker, or home attendants, or working a massage. Including Garden of Hope, like we are trying to explore more options like job replacement, job coaching, and also I know there's agencies helping with funding the clients to get scholarship and to do further education, but this is an area definitely needs much more work because there is no real options for the survivors right now, especially in the Chinese community. People don't really have options for jobs. So it's definitely not surprising that people would go back to choose the high risk occupations because there is just no options. And also they need to survive. They need to support their family and themselves. Next slide, please. So cultural competence.
We do have 2 questions. Sorry, we do have 2 questions in the chat that I'd love for you to answer before we move on to cultural competency. Can we go back a slide? The first question is, well, actually, I think we're going to get to that later, so I'm going to hold that one off about TNU visas. We'll come back to that in the next slide. But the other one is about family support. The question is, do any of the clients have babies or young children here in the US, or is that less common?
I wouldn't say it's super common, but we do have clients have babies or young children in here. So this is also an area of lack of resources. That family support is, so the resources are more tailored to the client. For us, we do have children and youth program that helping with secondary victims, do counseling and do parenting class. And yeah, this is definitely an area to explore. And especially family can be a huge support for the survivors, but also can have a lot of pressure on them to supporting them, even they're back in China. I hope that answered your question. Okay, and you're welcome. So can we move to next slide? Okay, cultural competency. I often find it very difficult to answer the question when people ask me what does cultural competence services look like to you? Because I think there's a lot of discussion around this topic, which is I think is really good, especially recent years, but I think it's very difficult to have a lot of concrete things because I mean, there's not a menu to tell you how to be cultural competent. And if there is a menu, definitely don't trust it. I think for me, cultural competence is definitely starting with understanding. So I know that most of you have worked with trafficking survivors, and some of you might have worked with victims in illicit massage parlors. That I don't know if you are familiar with the following statement. Like, I don't think that she is ready for services right now. I don't think, at least, like, she doesn't really want to continue services with me. She's very resistant to go to the police, not mention like she's definitely resistant to testify at court. At this time, I don't really think that she's ready for services. So those are the statements in different versions I do hear a lot. I think a lot of Chinese clients, they do appear evasive and not willing to cooperate, they're very resistant, not willing to get help, and not willing to share anything with you. And I can share some of my experiences or my understanding of why. So the first reason is definitely culturally, and especially you work with client in the massage business. In our community, there's a big stigma around sex, and there's a huge stigma around sex work. So people are worried about social consequences if they share this information, and this information being leaked out in the community. Because I mean, Chinese community in the US is relatively big, but also the network is very small. And the same reason for why people are not willing to go to the police officer is the same thing. Like, people worry about the social consequences, aside from the obvious reason for every human trafficking survivor is that you're afraid of retaliation from your trafficker. So testifying, those are also retaliation, and social consequences is definitely something really big. And a second reason, I think it's, so as an immigrant, you'll worry about anything that could harm your immigration status. Like, if I go to the law enforcement, would they know about my immigration status and report me? And this does happen. This is a valid concern. I do have clients have those experiences being reported to ICE by local law enforcement. If I go get healthcare, like if I use my Medicaid, would this bring up issues with public charge? Again, immigration issues. There's a lot of times that people have worries. They just didn't really have the chance to elaborate it to you. And the third reason, I think it might be the most important one, is simply trauma. A lot of our clients has gone through so many things, and what they learned through this trauma is to not trust anyone. If a client come in the first session and share everything with me, I will be very concerned. The trauma, what they learn is part of PTSD as well, to not trust anybody. And also, this is a very typical tactic the trafficker will use, is to know everything in your life, to know your difficulties, know your vulnerability, and use them against you. So they come in, they reach out to you, not supposed to trust you. So I think after understanding all the reasons behind why they look evasive or uncooperative, there is definitely something that we can do and to make this whole process less traumatizing and to make a better engagement in terms of services. So like being more patient. You're probably not able to get any, I guess, valuable information during the first or second session, and that is totally okay. And if you don't really have the time, refer them to a provider that would have more time to explore more things with them. And a confidentiality, like the role play shows that, yeah, that's nothing really wrong, but especially in the Chinese community, confidentiality is not something super familiar. What is a mandate reporter? Like, people don't really understand it. Make it simple. And also, don't just mention it at the first time, and be honest with your level of confidentiality. And throughout your session, throughout of your services, tell them where your confidentiality level is and make them feel safer to share things with you. And also be transparent. Be transparent about what's your limitation, what you can do, what you cannot do, and especially be transparent regarding risks. Like, for example, if they go to law enforcement, if they report a case, what is the risk involved? What are they expecting? There are probably many difficulties in front, and be transparent about that. And I guess to get out of a comfort zone. So I'm a mental health counselor. I'm trying to do therapy and psycho assessment, and that is it. I did not expecting taking this job and doing a lot of case management or legal assistance for like interpretation. But if you want to work with this clients, you want to work with this population, this is something you need to be mindful is this whole system is not perfect. We're imagining that this is the one stop that I engage with this client, and there will be another stop for them. Or maybe I can refer them to mental health. I can refer them to XYZ to address their individual needs. And a lot of times it doesn't happen. Your stop could very likely to be the last stop. So I guess be more comfortable knowing more things outside of your work. Like if you're a victim specialist and knowing something about like the more cooperation with law enforcement, like if you're attorney, maybe know some very basic relaxation skills that can help you with your assessment when the client's describing their experiences being super traumatized. And the last one, I guess you already heard this a lot, is respect their choices. And I find it's definitely very difficult when you actually do it. Like oftentimes we forgot those are the individuals. They don't really speak fluent English as you do, or they don't know the system better than you, but they are the survivors and sometimes even much better than us because they survive all of this. And they are totally capable of making decisions in their circumstances. Maybe they don't really have time to explain it to you, but they are making choices, the best choices out their situation. Like I give you a super simple example that, so I have a client that being identified and this client is eligible for T visa, but she's very resistant to get it. And also her immigration status at that time are very concerning. But she's really resistant and multiple providers has raised these concerns to me. And after explore it, it's simply because the client doesn't really have a sense of belonging here. She doesn't want to stay here. The reason that she stay here is make some money and repay her debt, and so she can go back home. So there's a lot of times many seems behind. Maybe they didn't tell you, but they do know what their choice is. And what we need to do is presenting those choices. And I think that is all I want to share with you. I will leave all the time to Kathy.
Thanks, Eve. If you could go to the next slide, please. Awesome. So I'm just going to speed through legal needs here because I know we've got, I think, 10 minutes left and still want to leave a little bit of room for Q&A. So first thing that I have up here is victim witness representation. And so I think sometimes people don't realize how much goes into reporting to law enforcement, particularly for people like our clients. When we send them in for law enforcement interviews, we do a lot of prep with them, and we also have to think very comprehensively about any potential criminal liability that they have. I think particularly with this population, sometimes while they are in these trafficking situations, they may have been coerced or forced to do criminal acts on behalf of the trafficker. And so all of that is stuff that you want to get straightened out with your client before you kind of bring them in front of law enforcement, because once they are in that interview, you know, law enforcement is driving that bus. And so we always make sure that we are there with our clients when they have law enforcement interviews, that we are in the loop, and also so that we can help coordinate things, because oftentimes these law enforcement interviews can be extremely re-traumatizing for our client. I think by their nature, they are fact-finding interviews, right? And so that process that Eve was talking about, which is so, I think, valuable when it comes to building trust in a relationship. You don't push too hard on the first meeting. You accept that, you know, you're not going to get a lot of disclosures because their walls are going to be up. But oftentimes when you're working with law enforcement, that's just a different kind of timeline, right? And so they are going to be asked very direct questions, very detailed questions about their experience, and being asked to recall these details from very traumatic parts of their past. And so we like to also be able to know the timing so we can coordinate with their counselors, right? With people who can support their mental health and make sure that they can process, debrief after the interview. Moving on to immigration, I know someone brought up U's and T visas in the chat. That is definitely, I think, bread and butter for us when it comes to applying for immigration relief for our trafficking survivor clients. I think one part of the T visa and with U visas as well is that kind of cooperation with law enforcement aspect. There is an exception for it in the T visa case if you are able to prove that your client is too traumatized to cooperate with law enforcement. What we found is that that can be a high bar to meet. And so oftentimes our clients do at some point need to have some kind of contact with law enforcement. And I know, I think I think it was Eve who talked a little bit about employment, and how that is also, I think, directly connected to their access to immigration relief. So with U's and T visas, generally, this is a little different in the U visa context, but generally you're not going to get work authorization until your application has been approved. And unfortunately, we've been seeing, I can say specifically for T visas, which are supposed to take a shorter amount of time than U visas, we've been seeing over a year-long waits for our clients. And so during that time period, if we're trying to get them out of an exploitative situation, but then don't have another employment option to offer them, and they don't have work authorization to be able to try to find another job, it puts them in a very difficult position, especially when you consider that many of them are already juggling multiple financial commitments, including very large debts in their home country. And then I also want, oh shoot, it's 4:25. I'll talk very briefly about the complex dynamics caused by existing representation. What I've heard from some other service providers is that when they see the client tells them, oh, I've already applied for asylum, so I'm good, I don't need help. Or they'll say, oh, I already got my work authorization, so I don't need help. We have seen huge patterns of immigration services fraud, particularly among the Chinese community. Oftentimes, these immigration service providers taking advantage of our clients' lack of familiarity with the US legal system and applying for asylum, kind of almost sight unseen, with the client having very little involvement with the process and not fully understanding what is in their application. I have clients who come to me and just say, oh, I've got a work permit, but tell me that no, they haven't applied for asylum, even though their category for work authorization is C8, which is the asylum applicant category for employment authorization documents. So there's a lot of fraud going on there. And so I would encourage that if you run into someone who is telling you this, to ask a few other follow-up questions just to see if they are in a position where they might need help, even if they're not fully aware of it. Okay, I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions in our remaining time.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. You all have so much expertise, and I know I've learned a lot, and I'm already hearing from people that they've learned a lot too. I just want to go to, if we could go to our next slide. I want to make sure everybody knows about our next part 3 training. We did have a question in the Q&A specifically about law enforcement and how they conduct operations in this situation. And that actually is going to be the focus of the next training, is a survivor-centered approach to investigation and prosecution of businesses involved in trafficking. So please do attend that on April 15th. And if you go to the next slide. And for a list of all of our upcoming trainings, you can visit our training page on Free to Thrive's website. Next slide. And we have our panelists' contact information here if you're interested in reaching out to them. And I want to jump right into the questions since we only have a few minutes. The first question is, what advice, if any, do you have for non-API advocates to garner trust and foster a relationship with the API population when doing intakes, etc.?
We only have a few minutes.
Yvonne, you can go.
I was like, we have a few minutes. But I think one of the biggest things is really, I think clients are really observant. And so if you are going to take time to get to know them and to understand them and to gain that trust, I think you have to go in with that. They know if you're going to try and rush things, they know if you're annoyed, like those types of things really, even if we don't intend to have that play out into a conversation with clients, I think it's just that. I think it's patience, understanding, learning. And I think it's also us understanding, as much as we want things to be fast and move forward quickly, we just need to really take time to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I would add, oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, just really quickly, I was just going to add again, to be patient. I think it might take a little bit longer, but don't let that deter you. I would say if you're worried about building trust with a a client who is Asian American, Pacific Islander, because you are not of that background, like, please don't let it deter you. I think as long as you are genuine and you're patient with them, I have had many clients who worked with non-Asian service providers before me and developed really good relationships with them, even when they didn't speak the same language. So it's definitely possible.
Really important. Our next question is, how long on average do you work with your clients? How long, in your opinion, do you believe it takes for a survivor to be able to live on their own without support in the US?
I think that's a really complicated question because the timing of it really depends on the person's circumstances and their lives. I will say, I think this question also has to do with privilege in terms of how we view that. Like, do clients have enough services? Are they stable enough? Are they getting enough resources to be stable? Is there overcoming mental health stigma and concern around what counseling looks like? The legal system, as Kathy mentioned, can depend on how long it takes. So I think part of it is some people, it takes many years. Some people it take a year. I think it just kind of depends, but I really encourage people to think about long-term care and not just like a 3-month period. I understand grants sometimes don't allow you to move past that, but really to have a system in place where people can still stay connected, even if the timing may necessarily not work out.
We do have a few more questions. We are at time. If any of the panelists need to go, I completely understand. If anybody else is available to stay for a couple extra minutes, we would love to answer a few more questions. Is that okay with our panelists? You're able to stay for a couple more minutes? Thanks so much. Okay, so one question from Dion. How are HT intervention courts different from other courts? And do you feel judges are respectful to survivors referred to your organization? So I would say judges may be inside and out of those courts for the second.
Yvonne, Eva, if you want to go,
it's
please.
okay. I can share. So I guess my experience is, so Human Trafficking Intervention Court, I guess, first of all, the whole purpose of it, and also like the diversion program that is specifically designed to explore the individuals with those similar charges and maybe potentially involve those high-risk occupations if there's any victimization, and to prevent it from being further victimized the client and help them to engage in services. But yeah, it's definitely an area that needs a little bit much more discussion. But what I see is in different other courts that is not Human Trafficking Intervention Court, I guess the whole process is less clear. That a lot of times clients don't really know what to expect with the cases, and the collaboration between social service providers, attorneys, and the court is not so close.
And I would say the courts are different for every. The courts are different for every state, and it depends on jurisdictions. I think it also depends on like age sometimes, and like what some certain like crimes are like categorized as. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But I mean, feel free to reach out to any of us if you wanted to, if your city or state is interested in doing something like this.
Kathy, anything to add before I go on to the next question?
No, I think that was perfect. Actually, even Yvonne have been working with the HTICs in New York for actually, I think maybe longer than I have. So they have a lot of expertise.
These are really helpful answers. All right, I'm going to make this our last question just because we are over time. Denise asks, on an international level, are we working with our Asian countries on the root causes for them entering into debt prior to arriving or seeking travel to the US?
That's a great question. I was actually looking at that in the chat and thinking about it. It's not something that Sanctuary has worked specifically on. I know we have partnered with nonprofits, for example, in China, to raise awareness about gender-based violence. And I think we've had some very successful collaborations on that front. So we haven't worked specifically on the question of debt. And I think this is something that is quite interesting because it's something that ostensibly, so my knowledge is mostly around China, so I'll speak to that area. Ostensibly, the Chinese government has been cracking down on these really predatory interest rates and loan terms. However, I think it's definitely still something that is ongoing, particularly because this practice of loan sharking, I guess you could call it, is so tied to organized crime in China. And there is a great deal, particularly at local levels, of corruption and ties with organized crime. So I think it's something that there just hasn't been a lot of successful enforcement.
Yeah, and just to quickly add, because we're talking about also root causes, I mean, I do want to also say that we have a lot of root causes still here in like the US. So while we also have people who travel to the US without debt, sometimes there's debt just accrued here from the United States from people who are taking advantage of this population. And so I think it's also something to really think about is we also have a lot of work to tackle here in terms of these root causes of debt, but also poverty. And we really need to be able to create more opportunities for people who are living in poverty, for undocumented folks, for people whose English is not their first language. And so I think we also need to consider what are we doing to provide more services for people in need so that there's more options available for people.
That is such a good point, Yvonne. And I just want to add on to that also that sometimes you even see this accrual of debt much more directly in the trafficking situation. I have had clients tell me that they get to the location that is out of state and then suddenly they are charged for a vastly inflated bus ticket price. They are being charged for rent every single night they stay at the massage parlor, even if they are literally sleeping on the same beds that they are expected to see customers. They are being forced to pay for their work uniform, just a whole slew of other costs that also drive them further into debt and force them to stay in that situation.
Those are really, really important points. It was a great question. Thank you so much for our audience member for asking that. I want to wrap up today's incredible training with a comment that was in the chat that is, I think many of us watching share the same feeling, which is just a thank you for educating us today, particularly after the tragedies this week in the API. People are really hurting right now, and just thank you for being open and willing to join us today in spite of this really tough week and educate us all, because it really is so important. And you all did such a beautiful job tying in what happened this week with this training. So just thank you so much to all of you. I'm very grateful to know you and learn from you. And I hope everybody watching and all of you take some time to take care of yourself this week and do whatever you need to do to process and grieve the loss that we've had. Thank you all, and take care.